Hey folks, welcome back. This time we're talking about Chapter 11, the Internet and Social Media. So we're going to start with several slides about how our online lives on the Internet are affected. And so one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, or maybe they're just starting to realize, is that any online information about you is now developed at birth, starting with the day you were born. Your medical records, a lot of your financial records, and then later on in life, perhaps your criminal records and other records are stored in a lot of different portals, accessible through a lot of different portals on the internet. So as we go more and more to electronic record keeping, for example, in the medical field, we're going to be seeing a lot more cases where in the future doctors can talk about your health history at the push of a button by accessing everything. And also, if you happen to be picked up for a crime in one state, they already have the capability, of course, through various databases that law enforcement uses, of locating any criminal record or history you might have in another location. And if you think about all the ways you're on the internet, from your credit card spending to your daily life and daily events and milestones in your life, increasingly those are going to be accessible through the online systems that we have in place now. So it is important that your online activities, that you control those, both for work and for play. I think some of you already know, and if you don't, get used to the fact that many companies, when you apply for a job now, do anywhere from a basic internet search of you, trying to find out what you might have posted on Instagram or Facebook or on Twitter or any of the other number of social media sites, and they're looking for information that might help them confirm whether you might be a good hire, or maybe you spend a little bit too much time in the bars and getting drunk and bragging about hating your existing job, or some other negative type of information that tells them maybe we're not going to hire this person. So because we all have an online record now, and there's virtually nothing we can do to prevent that, your personal contact online, both through social media and other forms of online presence, does influence others to make decisions about your life. And so one of the first pieces of advice that we often give students is go through and kill your online accounts and start all over, and with new names and everything, and do your best to not necessarily not come across as the person you are, the all things that make you good, and maybe a few things that make you a little bit not so good or dangerous, but to be a lot more careful about what you post from that point on, and make sure you're building in communications, we call it a brand, that you're branding yourself in a manner in which you eventually will want to get hired and work for various companies. So people that aren't very careful about that sometimes have events from their past come and haunt them. Another way that our online lives are affected by the internet is, like I said, managing and improving your online image. And a lot of people constantly struggle to delete the bad and add the good. And it's not only what you add or delete, but it's what others add or delete to your, for example, Facebook account. And I'm constantly clearing off posts that other people make on Facebook because I don't agree with them, and I don't want to have their thoughts reflected on me badly. So people who actively manage their social media accounts in particular and control what they do on the internet have a better time of presenting a more positive image to other people. But sharing your information online is unavoidable. Not only social networking, but anytime you make a purchase. One of the things that happens when you buy from stores is that they log that information away, and then a month later or 6 months later, they're back on the internet sending you a message, don't you want to buy another pair of these shoes? Or don't you, since you bought these one sets of concert tickets, there's another concert ticket series of concerts coming up, and don't you want to buy these tickets? And just merely doing content searches, like if you're researching material for a class or for work, The internet takes note of your IP address, that's your electronic address, your internet protocol address is what it's actually called, IP. Every computer has a unique IP address for giving and receiving information, and by keeping track of that, lots of people can track what you search for. This is the infamous, how did we know that someone was going to commit murder? Well, they spent 2 weeks before the murder researching all different ways to kill somebody without being caught. That happens in real life, actually, folks. So there are quite a few advantages to being online. When we talk about the internet, we're talking mostly about just being online to do things. A lot of people get their news that way. They can get it live or two-way through television, newspapers, magazines, through other bloggers, although I'll put a caveat there is that a lot of bloggers don't bother to fact check. They're merely putting an opinion out. So be careful how much of that you rely on, and be careful how trustworthy the sources are for your news. Obviously, another advantage of being online is entertainment. You know, we watch movies, we watch TV, we play games, we do lots of other kind of entertaining things. We have a social life online. We use Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or as I call it, Life in 140 Characters, and many other means of social media that aren't listed there to connect with family and friends, and also with what's going on in the world, what topics or memes are trending in the world. A lot of people use the internet or being online for professional development. LinkedIn is one such site. Excuse me. Not enough water today. In other words, LinkedIn is a site where you can go to post your resume and make contacts with current friends, current employers, and future employers. If you have a LinkedIn site like I do, then people are always visiting it and maybe finding out if you're good for a job. Shopping, I try to buy personally. My credo is to buy local whenever possible from local industries and shops. But sometimes, you know, if locally the pair of shoes is $120, not that I don't think I've ever spent $120. Let's say locally the pair of shoes is $70, and I can get them online for $58, shipping included. You know, I'm going to be tempted to shop online, and to this point I've been lucky. I've not been hacked by anybody taking my credit cards through online. Obviously, I mentioned friends earlier when I talked about social life, but finding old friends, making new ones. I've tracked down a lot of people that I knew in high school to help invite them to high school reunions. I've talked to people that I haven't seen in literally decades. And it's also a good way to reach family, for example, particularly if they live in a different part of the country or a whole different country than you're living in right now. Research, there's actual serious research you can do online in terms of quality and also in terms of quantity. And that varies everywhere from scientific research papers all the way down to YouTube videos and Wikipedia, which are considered a little bit less likely to be reliable research sources. Don't get me wrong, I like Wikipedia. It's a great place to get what I call the lay of the land. The most helpful part of Wikipedia entries to me is going to the bottom of the page, where they often list the primary sources where they got the information for the page. Perhaps it's the official site for this musical group, or it's a government report, or it's an historical document. So Wikipedia is a good place to go to get some foundational documents, but again, be a little bit leery, just like you are with news and anything else, about the quality of the material that's posted. Democracy, we always have some cases involved where citizens are debating democracy, whether something's good or bad, whether it's a government appointment or whether it's a social issue or an issue that just affects a lot of people. And it's a place, online is a good place to debate and share viewpoints. The concern is that too often we are not pursuing sharing those viewpoints in a very civilized manner. And I, from time to time, go off Facebook, for example, and we'll go 2 or 3 months without having Facebook, and I've got to admit my stress level usually goes way down. and I usually feel better when I'm not inundated with people wanting to yell at each other on Facebook, sometimes over important issues, sometimes over really innocuous ones. There are some disadvantages to be online too. Once it's out there, it is out there forever. You can scrub and erase and everything except destroy your own hard drive, and that will get most of it gone. But once the internet has distributed it to a lot of different places, it may be in somebody's memory cache forever. Certainly we've seen examples of where some of the social media sites have kept that data. If you're buying things online, obviously that can be a good thing. You can get good prices. I use the Amazon Smile a lot because not only do I get Amazon Smile Prime, not only with Prime, as much as I order, it pays for itself for free shipping, but the Smile version of Amazon Prime also sends a tiny bit of money to a charity of your choice. So you might want to check that out sometimes if you're interested in donating to a charity. So advertisements track your purchases, which can be good, but it can also lead to a lot of spam. It can lead to a lot of email from them, both on, for example, Facebook, but also just in your daily emails, because they track what you buy and start sending you either social media or email solicitations to buy more of the same stuff. Privacy problems. Problem is that people can hunt you down if you don't want to be found, if you want to remain anonymous. That's possible. I mentioned that I had, not too long ago, looked for names of some high school friends and some other people, and we were able to find a lot of them through social media and using the internet. But some people we never have found, and it's just because they don't own Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, and they're impossible to find. That could be a generational thing in my case, but I suspect that some people just don't get on and use social media. Predators, you may or may not have heard the term catfishing. That's when someone's out there, usually on a dating site, and they are trying to lure in someone, usually of the opposite sex, usually females. It's males usually trying to lure in females, and they're going catfishing. And that means they're catfish are by nature a fish that are bottom trollers, bottom feeders. So that's one of the reasons they're called catfishers. The other thing is that some people actually catfish by hand. They reach their hands down along the banks of a river or in the middle of a river and pull a catfish out by hand. So that term has to do with usually male predators trying to lure females in for nefarious purposes, either to accost them sexually or physically or both. Online can be expensive if you have enough money to have a computer and a phone and some of the other costs associated with being online, which a lot of college students do. They have to really sometimes save or be gifted by other people like parents or grandparents. But for a large part of the world, people can't afford a computer, not even a simple laptop, and they are part of that have-not population. So to them, being online, it can be very expensive. They can't afford the technology. I think some people get really addicted to online. They can't live without it kind of thing, and there are people in my own family that are on the internet. It seems like 18 to 20 hours a day, every waking moment when they don't have to physically be looking at something else for work. So it does change personalities too. It's like any other addiction. People can't peel themselves off from being on the internet and being on social media the same way they can't quit smoking or drugs. In some cases, I think the addiction is just as strong. There's a thing that a lot of people, including myself, think is a disadvantage of online. I call it electronic socializing. And this is when people got their phones out at the dinner table or some other time when they're supposed to be interacting with their friends and family. And instead, they are isolating themselves and killing the opportunity to have conversation or to practice even basic social skills. So Unfortunately, that's starting at an early age because parents now hand babies cell phones, and they get used to playing games, even small children. I saw a very smart 1.5 year old kid the other day playing a game on her mom's cell phone, and the mom was very proud of the fact that the girl knew how to play the game. Well, kids are pretty smart, and they will learn those behaviors. Unfortunately, once you've got that socializing, or actually it's anti-socializing skill, and the addiction in place, it can be really hard for younger people and older people to get away from that sort of addiction. And distracting. Again, a lot of us would rather be doing a lot of things other than studying or working. We'd like to relax, and there are healthy, good ways to relax, and being outdoors and in nature and hanging out with animals and doing social events with people, real live people. But sometimes if you're just stuck to the phone, looking at your phone, waiting for the next boing to go off, then that can be distracting you from some of the more natural pleasures in life. I'll just leave it at that. Very brief internet history. I'm not going to go into everything that's in the textbook, but digital technologies were first starting to be developed in the late 1940s. And again, the scope for the internet history and how the internet works is beyond the scope of this class. But the first sense of any kind of organization to the internet was called ARPANET. Started in the late 1960s, and they worked on it through to the late 1980s. It was renamed DARPA, and originally ARPANET stood for Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was a government project, and then they called it DARPA because it took a slightly different turn in 1973. It was renamed the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency because we were under some threats from other countries, and there was more concern about taking it from pure research to defensive research. In other words, trying to defend our country and even our planet from weapons of war. Microprocessors in really primitive forms were available before 1971, but 1971 is about the year when microprocessors became fairly commonly available to people who were building electronics. And all they are is miniature electrical circuits that process and store signals. In the, quote, old days, if you wanted to have a radio, you probably didn't have a transistor radio. You had a tube radio. In other words, the radios were big because they required big vacuum tubes inside of them in the 20s and 30s and 40s and even into the 50s. And so, in essence, microprocessors, by being able to make these electrical circuit boards smaller and smaller and smaller, and now so small you can put them in a tiny cell phone, was the creation in general that led to personal computers and made the net marketable. In other words, in the 50s, the most powerful computers on the planet were housed in multiple rooms of a research facility. And now you can hold them, in the palm of your hand. And the thing that people are fond of saying is that when Apollo 9 landed on the moon and we walked on the moon, and during that flight, there was not as much electronic circuitry as you might think there. In fact, a good Texas Instruments scientific calculator that might have come out 5 or 10 years after that had more electronic capacity than the Apollo 9 moon lander did at the time. So microprocessors, generally released in the 70s in the form of transistor radios, smaller transistor radios, and then have grown exponentially ever since then into situations where we're now possible to do things in extreme miniaturization. A second slide here, and again, this is not everything in the chapter, but if you're curious about when email came about, the various sources disagree, but we're going to go with what the book says, which is the first message was sent in 1971, the first ever email message. And obviously had been there was some development lead up in the late 1970s, which a follow-up that made it even more remarkable. We talk about fiber optic cable, or as we were talking about in the television chapter, cable network, and what came along in the mid-1980s, not necessarily in Wichita area then, but at other parts of the country. And cable was just simply another faster way to distribute data or information. Hypertext, or called HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, that's those blue links you see everywhere that you click on. That's just a shortcut. You click there and it takes you, for example, to another place on the internet. And it lets computers link to each other in a quick manner. So if you had to type out really long strings of code every time you wanted to go to a video about baby seal killings in the Arctic, it wouldn't be as fast as if you just clicked on a link that says baby seals or seal killing or something like that. Or an embedded link in an article where in the middle of the article the text turns blue and it's usually underlined, and you can click there and go automatically to that site on the internet. So HTML was developed as a way to, as a kind of a bookmark, you want to think of it that way, to allow you to go to different places, the consumer to go to different places quickly on the internet. And all three of these things have long histories and information in terms of development, but I think this is adequate for what we're talking about. Now, the internet began as a military-only system following the Cold War. The Cold War, people put it at different points of view. Most people put it, peg it at least the 1970s, or perhaps the fall of the Berlin Wall a little bit later than that. But it was originally a centralized network, and you can see the example of that in the graphic at the bottom on the far left in green. A centralized network has one center point and reaches out to many other points on the internet. And so if you had the center point be, for example, let's say NASA, and all those other data points, or there's linkage points out there at the ends of the green lines being various contractors that work with NASA to help develop a space program. It allowed for quick back and forth communication. What was the option? Well, the option was sending letters, snail mail, or phone calls. But the development of the internet allowed people to very quickly send messages from between contractors and a centralized agency like NASA. But that's just back and forth communication. The second example in magenta or pink, depending on your eyes and how they see, is a decentralized network. It was better, but because it might send out multiple links from a central point to small clusters of people. Now let's just guess that the center point is right there in the center of that diagram. And then if you take a line up to the extreme upper left corner, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 other things coming out of a secondary meeting point. And that, for example, maybe that center point on that one is all about engine development. And so the engine development people could all talk to each other. The eight groups that were responsible for that could all talk to each other about the engine development, and then the center core of that engine development could report back to NASA, which is the very center of the one. I'm trying not to make this overcomplicated. I think you just see that it's better, it's best distributed. But if, for example, a war ensued and an enemy wanted to cripple the engine development department, they could find a way to take out that engine development link and the other 8 links that report to it. So why we call it the web now is that we've gone to what's called the distributed network. And it allows this spider web network with many hubs. Those dots in the center, you can call them hubs. So you can see under C, which is the model we currently have, a distributed network, even if one link is cut off, even if one link to a different hub is cut off, there's multiple ways to get back to that hub. And that is actually what we've seen. There's a very simplified description. There's tens of, not hundreds of thousands, if not a million or billions of connections with hubs. So this has led to the reasoning that even if part of the internet goes down, there's still no way to decapitate the entire internet, particularly in wartime, which is what the main concern of this was as it's developed over the last couple decades. So this is why the internet is seen as the vast information superhighway. You can get from the farthest left hub on that sketch to the farthest right hub on that sketch in multiple ways. So we think of the internet sometimes being slow, whereas if you're actually watching, it tells you how long it took to connect to a hub from Wichita, Kansas to Sydney, Australia. It's on the order of milliseconds or parts of a millisecond. It really is very, very fast for the most part. So Web 1, or World Wide Web 1, was not developed, underline not, boldface not, by Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States. He misspoke at one point and seemed to claim, seemed to lay claim to the fact that he was the inventor of the internet. Well, he wasn't. So the guy who's most frequently credited, and there were lots of people, men and women, with inventing the internet, the World Wide Web at least, was a guy named Tim Berners-Lee. Remember that name. You're going to need it. And that's a picture of him, and he's still fairly young. That's not an incredibly old picture. But he developed the World Wide Web at a facility called CERN in Switzerland in the late 1980s, not Al Gore. So CERN, I'm going to skip down to the third bullet point. If you watch Big Bang Theory, you've heard, or you probably saw the episode where one of the characters, whose name escapes me, Leonard, gets a chance to go visit the CERN research site in Switzerland, and various people are begging him to go with him because he has one more thing, and he decides to take Penny with him, even though she probably doesn't care or understand much of what the research is. Sheldon finally gets a chance to go with him, and then Sheldon comes down with some horrible cold, and so Penny ends up going. You know, there's comedy and hijinks with that. But CERN is a very important research facility, and my French is really rusty, but Conseil Européen pour la Recherche Nucléaire, or it stands for actually European Organization for Nuclear Research. But if you remember CERN, that's all you have to remember. He used CERN to develop research and to guide experts in sharing data on particle smashing. CERN is basically a particle smashing facility where they send really long circular tunnels. They have them underground, and they crash particles together at extreme high speed. And that's why it says there in the third bullet point, it has the Large Hadron Collider. Now, it's beyond my scope and probably this course scope to talk about what hadron colliders do. But he was capable of developing enough research to lead to this theory of how the web could be really perfected. So the first website that they experimented with was in 1989, and believe it or not, it was on the network CNN. They were trying to see how many hubs of CNN they could connect. So in 89, Berners-Lee was the one who developed a new computer language, the one we just talked about a minute ago, called hypertext markup language. In other words, the blue links, and that's an example of what a blue link looks like, that you click on to open documents and transport yourself across the web, or across the web universe, sometimes people say. So what do you need to know? Well, it was Tim Berners-Lee who helped develop and bring the World Wide Web to a fruition in the late 1980s. Maybe that CNN was the first site they experimented with. It was done at CERN, and then he invented hypertext markup language, HTML, or the blue links. And again, that's called Web 1.0 because it was just the development phase of the web. Web 2 is sort of a phase we're in now, and we're getting into increasingly more complicated and better methods of distribution and use. When we had Web 1, if you see in the graphic, initially about 100,000 websites within the first decade or less, and it was what was called read-only web. You couldn't actually go back and forth. It was one way from a cloud. Think of that cloud up there like the hub, down to a certain number of populace, and eventually it would reach about 50 million users through 100,000 websites. We're now pretty much into the Web 2 phase. Well, not pretty much, we are, and we're heading towards Web 3. This graphic is a little old, but it shows that there are approximately 100 million websites. It's actually more than that. But now we have what's called a read-write web. So the web is getting bigger, that cloud is bigger, contains more sites, more information, and not only can people publish stuff off the web, and that's the down arrow to the white people, but also we as users can generate our own content. We're blue. We can upload it to the cloud. And when we get to Web 3, the only addition to that, in addition to the growth of the number of websites and the fact that there's more user-generated content in Web 3.0, is that now you got that green oblong circle in the middle of the cloud that says intelligence. And so we're at the cusp of beginning to experiment with true artificial intelligence. And at some point, there is the hope of some and the dread of others that the internet will be self-controlling. It'll be self-censoring. It'll be able to weed out certain things. Now, when we talk about equal access and opportunity to the web, and we talk about net neutrality, one of the things that is a concern is if we don't have net neutrality, which currently we don't, it was taken away just this year, then people who pay less can afford to pay less for access to the internet, and will have lesser say in what material goes into the cloud, how they interact, and development of intelligence technologies to govern that. So that's sort of an in the future concern. I just want to talk briefly about this. You could look at the data forever. This is from the most current data from a very reliable source called internetworldstats.com. It's copyright 2018. The data is from the end of last year, 2017. And it's interesting to look at several things. For example, a comparison of the countries with their populations, or estimated 2018 populations. And then if you go to the internet growth over the years on the far right, you will see that right now China is in the lead with 772 million internet users as of December 31st of 2017. That's in that fourth column. So the main reason is, if you look at the second column, their population is bigger than any other country or region. So naturally, that bodes well for them. However, if you look on the far column, or far right column, their internet growth is only about 3.3%. So they may be bigger and have a larger population, have more internet users, but they're not growing as fast. India comes in second, just slightly second in terms of population, but quite a bit in second place in terms of internet users. But the growth there is much stronger, over 9% growth. So India is a growing internet hub. Partly that's because there are more and more businesses being formed and developed in India. Partly it's because of their already large size. So there are 1.35 billion people, just slightly under 1.442 billion people in China. But they're growing faster. And, as they grow faster and faster, they're going to probably eventually overtake China. Sometimes when we call to get help with various product help, like computers and stuff, we seem to get a person from India many times, and that's because that service industry has moved overseas a lot to India. United States comes in third, and if you can see, our population is significantly smaller, on the order of 1 billion, even more than 1 billion below India. And that the number of internet users, however, is respectable at 312 million, compared to 772 and 462. But look at our growth rate. The United States is still exploding with internet growth rate, 227%. So there's a chance that even though our population may not nudge up, because of the popularity of the internet in America, that we eventually could go into second place, possibly first. And rounding up the top 5 are Brazil and Indonesia. I suspect because of some economic issues in Brazil that by the end of 2018, that Brazil may drop a notch. But you can kind of see the top 20 there, and a couple of the ones that I think are a little surprising is that Bangladesh is as high as 10th, but the growth there is more than 80,000%. Vietnam is at 13th, but this growth is nearly 32,000%. So you can see the growing countries in terms of internet use and the ones that aren't, they're stagnant or actually falling behind a little bit. Germany is a surprise at number 11th because their growth, although good, in fact a little better than U.S., is still lagging behind, and again, partly because that country is not as populous. So if you don't have time to actually look through all this and study it, if you go to www.internetworldstats.com, this is, I believe, the most current chart. They update it toward the end of every year, or the beginning of the following year. So it's worth thinking about. It's worth talking about, again, in terms of haves and have-nots. So a couple of issues. One of them is that people talk about a lot when they're talking about the internet and its popularity or access is the need that a lot of people feel for better access to rural and poor areas. And I keep bringing up this thing about the haves and the have-nots. The haves being the people that have the money or have the technology available in their area, have the money to buy technology and equipment and know how to use it. And the have-nots, people who, even in America, don't have the money or technology available. It raises the question of whether internet is a necessity or luxury. Now, I think as a student, you would probably argue, and as a communication professional, if you end up doing that it's become a necessity. Another issue that's coming up is, can third world companies compete for business? And I think that there's a trend towards showing that, yes, they can. And in the case of India alone, you don't necessarily have to be a manufacturing company to increase internet usage. In fact, if you're in the business of communicating or providing access to people or using the internet and helping people with technology, you can definitely show some growth there. I just want to make sure everybody understands what cloud storage is. Cloud storage is like the hard drive you don't own. It's so massive. And a lot of people pay for extra storage off-site of their computer. I'm one of them. It doesn't cost very much. It costs me 99 cents a month or something like that through Apple. And you can store vastly more amounts of equipment that's available up, quote, in the cloud. In other words, it's on remote servers, not servers or hard drives that are on your computer physically or attached to your computer. So as long as you have those all well backed up, that is a good place to get nearly infinite storage. Then something that's not in the chapter, but I call the Wikipedia problem, and I mentioned this earlier. Wikipedia is full of unreliable information. I don't know if you knew it or not, but anybody, including you, can create a Wikipedia entry and fill it with whatever you want to fill it with. I did that as an experiment for a writing class several years back, where I created a Wikipedia entry about a fictitious battle that had been fought, a few hundred years ago. And as a writing class and as a writing exercise, I said, go to this site on the internet and write a story based on this entry. And I had a complete battle. I had all kinds of links to pictures and pictures on the actual Wikipedia site. And I made up fictional reports, and I created a very convincing Wikipedia site for this battle. Well, the problem was it was all false entry. There was no such battle. There was no such town in England where it occurred in 1236 or whenever it was. At least not that I could find on contemporaneous maps. And all the actions and counteractions of two armies, they weren't physically located near each other at the time. In other words, I made the whole thing up. And the purpose of the exercise, the students, some of whom wrote really almost flawlessly good stories, was to trust your sources. And that's one of the things that, as we talked about in newspapers, but we also talk about when it comes to internet searches, is you have to be very careful to discern how truthful your sources are being. And then we get to hacking, data breaches, people getting hacked or worse, and this year alone there's been quite a few announced. Even as I say this, Facebook just got about 50 million Facebook users just got hacked, and my wife was one of them, and so they had to go and create new passwords. There are data breaches that take money out of bank accounts, that reroute it to other people. And I think that this is an issue that is getting increasingly worse on the internet. I mentioned net neutrality, which is basically a term that refers to how the internet is regulated. The idea for net neutrality came into play about 2015. Was put into place during part of the Obama administration, and the central tenet of net neutrality is that all data should be treated equally. You shouldn't discriminate or charge people differently based on who they are, what the content is, what the website looks like, what the platform is, in terms of various pieces of software and hardware that could house an internet site, how it's applied, any types of attached equipment like cloud systems, or any method of communication. In other words, everybody's on the same level playing field. That concept went away with the Trump administration. They fought hard to eradicate that. Net neutrality was under congressional scrutiny in November of 2017, and it was shot down in 2017, but there were numerous congressional appeals, and it was awaiting approval by other members of Congress. But officially, net neutrality ended in June of 2018. And in your weekly folder is an article that goes into more detail on the history of all of that. So now people are fearing that it's starting to create a 2 or 3 tiered approach to net, meaning that people who can afford to pay for extremely fast internet use, or higher end content, will get their way with faster speeds and will edge out the rest of us who are going to be eventually on a much slower form of the internet. And maybe if we have a business, for example, it could get bumped off by other more quote important or expensive internet sites. So it's a concern for people who worry about everyone being treated fairly and equally. And I have to say that I am a fan of net neutrality, but it's no longer the law of the land. It may come back at some point in the future. Fake news. There's a lot of information about fake news and what it constitutes, and I also put a video. It's a little bit longish. I think want to say it's between 8 and 12 minutes long in your weekly folder about fake news. It talks about how fake news has been around for quite a while, and then what the differences between fake news and real news is. And but I want to give you a definition that came from the Urban Dictionary, which is a kind of an offbeat dictionary. It's not Merriam-Webster. And the term they use for fake news, or definition they use for fake news, is a term that was used to be used to describe websites primarily, consisting entirely of intentionally fabricated news stories, but now used to describe virtually anything that does not mesh with one's own views. Now, there have, for hundreds of years in American media, there have been completely fabricated news stories, and there's quite a few good examples of that. But that form of sensationalized or fabricated news kind of went away for a long period of time as journalism and newsmakers and newspapers got more attuned to scientific principles of being fair and balanced and objective, or trying to be. But now it's often being used to describe anything that doesn't fit one's personal point of view. So there's some examples there, but these are quotes from various people. The New York Times is fake news. This is fake news from the CIA. And this source for this entry comes from an article in a publication called Vice, an online publication called Vice. So by mesh with one's own views, what I mean is, well, that's your truth. That's your version of the news. I have a different, equally truthful version of the news. And unfortunately, the two can't logically coexist. So we've seen a real uptick in this in the last 2 years in the political realm. And it remains to be seen how this is going to be sorted out. But now, in addition to trying to, now the news media has a different problem, their credibility, but it's also being challenged by the fact that some mainstream politicians are claiming that journalists are no longer even trying to be credible, that they're manufacturing information. Most mainstream journalists outlets say that that's not the case. They make mistakes, and occasionally there's some intentional fabrication of news. And I think if you watch the video, you get some examples of that. But by and large, the American media are not out to deceive the public. That's what they say. So this is the last slide here, called The Future. And I don't have any really strong words of wisdom to impart. But the internet raises more questions, I think, than it answers. We have a problem right now with the internet, how it's engaging with our democracy, both in terms of real news and fake news, in terms of privacy versus secure information. And so is that going to bring us all together, or is that going to divide us as a country? And right now we're kind of in the divide mode, seems like. How much can we believe, or can we believe what we read, see, and hear? Increasingly, that's a point that we have to wrestle with. Is all of this fighting over the quality of newspapers and journalism going to enhance the economy? Will it hurt or increase political divisiveness? And it leads to a basic general question: is the internet socially redeeming? In other words, is it worth the trouble? Or is it a bastion of poor manners and bad taste? And a lot of people say that it's no longer a reputable source of information and should be regarded as something very suspect. So those are questions you can ask yourself and see how you feel about things. Any one of those questions, if you had to write a paper for a communication class or another class, even a history class or something, would be topics worth considering, and so this information might be usable to you on that basis. So I think that's it. Yes, that's all. I'm going to leave you with something to laugh about, where one dog's talking to the other, and he says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So I guess that's an upbeat thing to end on. Thanks a lot.